The Varun Empire had ruled the galaxy for longer than most species could remember. 600 star systems fell under its flag. Thousands of alien races paid tribute to its throne. Its warships moved through space like great dark shadows, and wherever those shadows fell, civilizations either bowed or burned. The Empire had not lost a war in over 1,000 years. It had not even come close. Fleet Admiral Drauvik Sorn stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and looked out at the stars with the calm expression of a man who had never once feared them. He was tall for a Varun, with gray-blue skin, 4 narrow eyes that swept the room with constant precision, and a record of 42 successful campaigns behind him. He was the most decorated officer in the Imperial fleet. He was also, by his own private opinion, the most capable. The ship was currently on the outer edge of the galaxy, moving slowly toward a region known as the Veiled Reach. It was not a glamorous assignment. The Veiled Reach was a long, dark arm of the galaxy that sat far from any major trade route or inhabited system. The stars there were old and dim. The planets were cold and barren. For centuries, it had been considered empty and worthless, not even marked on most Imperial navigation charts. The assignment was routine: survey the region, plant Imperial beacons, mark it as claimed territory. A job for a junior admiral, most would say. But the Emperor's Council had specifically requested Drauvik lead the mission, and Drauvik did not question the Council. He suspected it was a political move. Some rival in the Council wanted him away from the core systems for a few months, and it did not matter. He would do the job quickly and return. His fleet was made up of 60 warships, clean, modern, well-armed, the finest vessels in the Imperial arsenal, powered by gravity-fold engines and carrying enough firepower to crack a moon. Drauvik had handpicked the crews himself. Whatever the Veiled Reach held, he was more than ready for it. The first week passed without incident. The fleet moved through dead systems, cataloged empty planets, and planted beacons in the cold dark. The crew was bored. Officers played strategy games in the mess hall. Engineers ran maintenance checks just to have something to do. Drauvik himself spent his evenings reviewing old campaign reports and drinking warm Varun wine in his private quarters. Then the probes started disappearing. It began on the 8th day. A long-range scout probe sent ahead of the fleet simply stopped transmitting. No warning, no damage report, no final signal. It was there one moment and gone the next. Drauvik noted it in his log and sent another probe along the same route. That one disappeared too. Over the next 3 days, 6 more probes were lost, all in the same general direction, all without any trace. No wreckage was found. No energy signatures were detected at the last known positions. The probes simply ceased to exist. His chief sensor officer, a young Varun named Tessik, brought the data to Drauvik on the 10th day with a slightly nervous look on his face. Drauvik studied the reports for a long moment. "Spatial anomaly?" he asked. "We considered that," Tessik said, "but the probes use different frequency bands and different navigational systems. A natural anomaly would not affect all of them the same way. And the disappearances are not random. They follow a pattern. Something out there is finding the probes and destroying them." "Something," Drauvik repeated flatly. "Yes, Admiral, something." Drauvik sent a full scout ship next, a real vessel with a crew of 12, equipped with short-range weapons and a reinforced sensor array. He told them to be careful, to maintain constant contact, and to retreat at the first sign of anything unusual. He received a transmission from them 40 minutes after they entered the search zone. The signal was broken and full of static, but the words came through clearly enough. The crew were reporting large objects on their sensors, many of them. "Old," the sensor officer was saying. "Very old. Dark, not moving." Nara, the crew were slowing down to get a better look. Then the signal cut out. For 7 hours, there was nothing. Drauvik kept the fleet at a full stop and waited. He did not show concern on his face, but inside he was very alert. He had not reached his position by ignoring things that made no sense. On the 8th hour, a distress beacon activated. It was coming from the scout ship. Drauvik immediately dispatched 2 escort vessels to retrieve it. When the escort ships returned and docked with the Eternal Dominion, Drauvik was already in the medical bay waiting. The scout ship was barely functional. Its hull was scored with damage that his engineers could not immediately identify. Not plasma burns, Not projectile impacts. Something else. Something that had eaten into the metal in long, clean lines. Like the ship had been gripped by something enormous. Most of the interior systems were fried. The entire crew of 12 was dead except for one. Her name was Junior Navigator Seetha Van. She was young, barely 2 years out of the Imperial Academy. When they pulled her from the ship, she was breathing but unresponsive. Her uniform was torn, and her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that Dravik found deeply unsettling. Not fear exactly, something beyond fear. The medical team worked on her for an hour before she became conscious enough to speak. Dravik stood at her bedside and watched her carefully. "What did you see?" he asked, keeping his voice steady and calm. She turned her head slowly and looked at him, her eyes focused with visible effort. "Ships," she said. "Hey, what kind of ships?" "Big." She swallowed with difficulty. "Very big. Old. Very, very old. Covered in dust and damage. Like they had been sitting out there for a long time. We thought they were dead. We got close to look. And then, lights came on," she said quietly. "From inside. All at once. Like they had been sleeping and we woke them up." Dravik leaned slightly forward. "What happened next?" "They didn't fire at us right away. They just looked at us. I know that sounds strange, but that's what it felt like they were studying us. Then a signal came through. Not our language, very old. Our translation system barely picked it up." She paused and closed her eyes for a moment. "It said, unauthorized vessel detected. Identify yourself by species and allegiance." The room was very quiet. "We transmitted our imperial identification codes," she continued. "Standard protocol. And then everything went dark on our ship. Like something reached inside and turned everything off. The crew started dying. Systems failed. Life support dropped. I found an emergency oxygen unit and a distress beacon in a supply locker. I hit the beacon and hid in the locker. That's all I remember." Dravik looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he asked one more question. "The ships, did you see any markings on them? Any symbols?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, on the largest one. A flag painted on the hull. It was faded and cracked, but you could still see it. Blue and green. Round shape in the middle. I didn't recognize it." She paused again, and something shifted in her expression. Something that made the medical officer in the room take a small step backward without quite knowing why. "And Admiral, the lights in the windows. I saw them moving. There were people inside those ships. They were watching us, and some of them were..." She stopped. "What?" Dravik said. "Smiling," she said. "They were smiling at us." She died 4 minutes later. The medical team said her heart simply gave out. Dravik suspected it was something else. He suspected she had seen something that the body simply could not carry out of that place and go on living normally. He walked back to the command deck alone and stood at the viewport for a long time. Around him, the crew moved quietly, watching him from the corners of their eyes, waiting for orders. He thought about the flag she had described, blue and green, sunken with a round shape in the middle. He had seen that description somewhere, in old files, in historical records that nobody read anymore. He called his chief historian to the deck. The historian was an older Varun named Orvan, thin and dry, who spent most of his time in the ship's archive room and rarely spoke to anyone. He arrived looking mildly annoyed at being disturbed. "Tell me about the humans," Dravik said. Orvan blinked slowly. "The humans." "Yes." The historian was quiet for a moment. "Admiral, the humans have been extinct for 3,400 years. They were a minor species, single homeworld, a few scattered colonies, extremely aggressive, even by primitive standards. The Empire's ancestor fleet conducted the Purge of the Weak campaign against them during the early expansion period. Their home world was neutralized. Their colonies were neutralized. The species was declared extinct approximately 2 centuries after the campaign concluded, when no further human activity was detected anywhere in known space." He paused. "They are a footnote in Imperial history, a cautionary example used in the Academy to explain why primitive, aggressive species must be dealt with early." "Their flag," Dravik said. "What did it look like?" Orvan thought for a moment. "Their most common flag during their spacefaring period was a depiction of their home planet as seen from orbit. Blue Ocean, Greenland, round, called the Earth flag, I believe. He tilted his head slightly. Why do you ask? Dravik looked back at the dark stars of the Veiled Reach. Because one of my crew saw that flag painted on the hull of a ship out there. A very large, very old ship, with people inside it. Orvain did not speak for a very long moment. Dravik turned from the viewport and walked back to his command chair. He sat down and pulled up his communications terminal. He was going to send a report to the Imperial Council, but before he did, he made another decision. He would not wait for Council instructions. The Council was weeks away at communication speed. He would handle this himself. He would send a punitive fleet into the Veiled Reach. 40 warships, fully armed. Whatever was out there, old ships, old machines, some strange survival of a dead species, it would be found and it would be destroyed. He had done it 42 times before. He would do it a 43rd time and be home before the Council even finished reading his report. He began composing his orders with calm, the efficient hands completely unaware that he was about to make the worst decision in the history of the Varun Empire. Outside in the deep dark of the Veiled Reach, the old ships waited. They had been waiting for a very long time. A little longer was nothing. They were patient. Humans always had been. The punitive fleet left within the hour. 40 warships in tight formation, engines glowing against the dark, moving toward the Veiled Reach with the quiet confidence of a hammer that had never once failed to hit its nail. Dravik watched them go from the command deck of the Eternal Dominion and felt the familiar calm that came before a clean and simple operation. Find the target, assess, destroy, return. He had done it so many times the steps felt like breathing. He kept his flagship and the remaining 20 ships back at a safe observing distance. Protocol required it when the nature of the target was not yet fully understood. He was not afraid. He was precise. There was a difference, and Dravik understood that difference very well. Commander Hesk led the punitive fleet. She was experienced, sharp, and loyal, a veteran of 11 campaigns who had never lost a ship under her command. She took the 40 vessels in a widespread formation, covering a broad front as they pushed deeper into the Reach. Dravik monitored the mission from his flagship through a live feed on the main screen. He could see the sensor data in real time, hear the communications between ships, and watch the tactical display as it updated every few seconds. For the first 30 minutes, there was nothing unusual. Empty space. Waiting at cold stars, the faint signal of the beacons they had planted earlier in the week. The fleet moved steadily forward, running full scans in every direction. Then the contacts appeared on the sensors. They were not moving. They were just sitting there in the dark, spread across a region of space roughly 2 million kilometers wide. The sensor returns were strange at first. Hesk's sensor team thought they were reading asteroids or debris because the shapes were so irregular, so broken-looking, so covered in what appeared to be centuries of accumulated dust and micrometeorite scarring. But then the computer began processing the forms, and the outlines started to resolve. Ships, dozens of them, then more, then many more. They were enormous. The largest ones were nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, while even the smallest were bigger than any warship in the Varun fleet. Their hulls were dark and deeply weathered. There were holes in some of them where old impacts had punched through the armor long ago, and the metal around those holes had twisted and curled with age. Sensor arrays were broken, hanging loose. External weapon systems appeared fused and non-functional. Navigation lights were dark. Engine ports showed no heat signature at all. They looked absolutely, completely dead. Commander Hesk sent the report to Dravik and requested instructions. Dravik studied the sensor images on his screen for a long moment, then replied simply, "Move in closer. Full scan. Confirm no power signatures before you engage." Hesk acknowledged and the fleet moved in. At approximately 800 kilometers from the nearest ship, so the scanner teams reported something. Not a power signature exactly, more like a vibration. A low, deep pulse running through the hulls of the derelict vessels, too faint to identify clearly. Hesk flagged it as possibly structural, possibly some natural resonance caused by the gravitational interaction of so many large metal objects in proximity. She noted it in her log and continued the approach. At 400 kilometers, the nearest derelict ship began to change. It was subtle at first. The fine dust that had settled over its hull over centuries began to drift away. not blown by anything visible, just lifting off slowly as if the ship were exhaling. Panels along the hull that had appeared fused began to shift, separating cleanly along seams that nobody had seen because they were too perfect to notice. Deep inside the ship, somewhere behind that scarred and ancient armor, something was warming up. Then the lights came on, not dim or flickering, not the weak glow of emergency power. Full operational lighting, blazing out from windows and sensor ports and weapon housings, sharp and white and absolute. One ship, then the next, then 20, then all of them, lighting up in sequence across 2 million kilometers of space like a city waking at dawn. The darkness of the Reach vanished. The 40 warships of Hesk's fleet were suddenly sitting in the middle of a field of brilliantly lit giants, surrounded on all sides. The silence on the communication channel lasted 3 full seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Hesk cut through the noise with a sharp command, and the channel went quiet. Her voice, when she spoke again, was admirably steady. On all ships, hold position. Do not fire without my order. Sensors, give me a full readout now. The readout came back, and Hesk was quiet for a moment. Drovik, watching from his flagship, felt something move in his chest. Not fear, something adjacent to it, something he had not felt in a very long time. The power signatures coming off those ships were not ancient. They were not weak or damaged or inconsistent. They were clean, strong, and stable, the kind of output you expected from a fully operational, modern military vessel at combat readiness. The sensor team could not identify the power source. It matched nothing in the Imperial database. The energy output on the larger ships was, per his sensor chief's careful and slightly shaking words, significantly beyond anything we have on record. Then a transmission came through on a very old frequency. The translation system caught it and converted it into standard Imperial speech. The voice was human, calm, unhurried, and carried the particular flatness of someone who was not the least bit impressed by what they were looking at. Unidentified Varun fleet, you have entered a restricted zone. You destroyed one of our scout contacts 6 days ago, and you have now brought a combat-configured fleet to our location. Under the standing rules authorized by the United Earth Naval Command, this constitutes a hostile act. We are logging the time. We are logging your fleet configuration. Retaliation protocol is now active. You have 30 seconds to begin withdrawal. Commander Hesk immediately opened a channel back. This is Commander Hesk of the Imperial Varun Fleet. You are operating in Imperial claim space. Identify yourselves and stand down your vessels immediately, or we will open fire. There was a pause of about 4 seconds. 20 seconds remaining, the human voice said. One of the captains on Hesk's left flank opened fire. Nobody later could say for certain whether it was nerves or orders or just a breaking point, but one ship discharged its primary plasma cannons directly at the nearest human vessel at full power. The shot hit the hull dead center with enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The armor absorbed it, not deflected, not scattered. The plasma hit that ancient, scarred, weathered hull, and the hull simply took it. For a half second, the point of impact glowed orange, and then the glow faded, and the hull was unchanged. A slight ripple ran across the surface like a stone dropped into still water, and then it was still again. Another captain fired, then 3 more. Then Hesk gave a full fire order, and all 40 ships opened up simultaneously. The Reach lit up with plasma, particle beams, kinetic rounds, and concentrated energy weapons. Everything the Imperial fleet had, pouring into the human ships in a storm of violence that would have destroyed a small fleet on its own. The human ships did not move. They sat perfectly still inside the storm, and they let the Empire throw everything it had at them. And when the firing stopped because the Imperial ships needed to recharge their weapons, the human ships were completely undamaged. Retaliation protocol authorized, the human voice said. It sounded, if anything, slightly bored. What happened next lasted exactly 11 minutes. Drovik watched it from his flagship with the focused, horrified attention of a man seeing something that his mind could not quite process in real time. He saw beams of light come from the human ships that were not any color he recognized, hitting Varun vessels and simply splitting them apart at the structural joints, as though the ships had been taken apart by careful, precise hands. He saw weapons he had no name for reach out across hundreds of kilometers and find targets with perfect accuracy. He saw Varun warships, the finest in the Empire, with armor that could withstand sustained bombardment, come apart like they were made of dry wood. He saw no human ship take any damage whatsoever. In 11 minutes, 38 of the 40 ships were gone. Not crippled, not drifting, gone. 8 of the last 2 were still intact, sitting motionless in space with all their power cut, completely disabled but fully preserved. The human ships surrounded them like walls, close enough that every camera on those 2 ships could see nothing but ancient gray hulls stretching in every direction. The transmission came again. Same voice, same unhurried tone. 2 vessels have been preserved for return. You will take them back to your fleet command. You will tell your admiral that we know he is watching. You will tell him that what he just saw is a single patrol wing, 16 ships. We have more. Many more. A pause. You have 30 days. After 30 days, we come out of the reach. The 2 disabled ships powered back on. Their engines came up slowly, sluggishly, like animals released from a grip. Their crews, alive and unharmed and completely silent, turned the ships around and began moving back toward Dravik's waiting fleet. Dravik stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched them come. Around him, his crew was absolutely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The tactical display showed the massive human fleet sitting calmly in the dark behind the 2 returning ships, lights blazing, engines warm, waiting. He had sent 40 ships. He had gotten 2 back. He thought again of what old Orvain had told him. A minor species. Primitive. Aggressive. Extinct. A footnote in history. He looked at the tactical display for a long time. Then he opened a channel directly to the Imperial Council. He was going to need every fleet the Empire had. He was going to need allies he did not have. He was going to need things he was not sure even existed. And somewhere in the back of his mind, below all his training and his pride and his 42 victories, something was whispering to him that it was not going to be enough, that nothing was going to be enough, that humanity had not spent 3,000 years hiding in the dark just to lose. He pressed the transmit button and began to speak. His voice was steady. It was the steadiest thing left in the entire Varun Empire at that particular moment. Outside in the Veiled Reach, the human ships turned off some of their lights. Not all of them, just enough to remind the darkness that they were still there, watching, patient, and very, very ready. The Imperial War Council met in the Grand Chamber of Varun Prime 3 days after Dravik's report arrived. They sat around a table wide enough to land a small aircraft on. 12 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, dressed in ceremonial armor and old titles, and they were very, very quiet. Dravik had transmitted everything. The sensor logs, the tactical footage, the communication recordings, the complete record of 11 minutes in which 40 of the Empire's finest warships were reduced to scattered atoms by 16 ships that had supposedly not been active for 3,000 years. The council members had watched the footage twice before the meeting started. Nobody had asked to watch it a third time. Grand Commander Vethal, the highest military authority in the Empire below the Emperor himself, finally spoke. He was an old Varun, heavily built, with the kind of face that had spent decades learning not to show surprise. He was showing something close to it now. What do we actually know about the humans? He said. Not the official record, not the Academy summary. What do we actually know? That was the question that sent historians, intelligence officers, and archivists scrambling through the deepest levels of the Imperial Records database for the next 72 hours straight. What they found, piece by piece, layer by layer, rewrote everything the Empire thought it knew about the species it had spent 3.5 millennia calling extinct. The Purge of the Week campaign had taken place during the early expansion period of the Empire. Roughly 34 centuries ago, when the Empire was still young and hungry and deeply afraid of anything it could not immediately control. The humans had been identified as a threat not because of what they had done, but because of what the Empire's analysts believed they would eventually do. The humans were aggressive by nature, the report said. They were inventive. They were stubborn. They reproduced quickly. They adapted to hostile environments with ease. Left alone, they would spread. Left alone, they would become powerful. The Empire's early strategists had seen only one logical course of action. The fleet that had gone to Earth was enormous for its time. It glassed the planet in 4 days. It then moved to the 17 known human colony worlds and did the same thing, one by one. The campaign took less than 2 years. When it was over, the analysts declared humanity extinct, filed their reports, and moved on to the next problem. But the analysts had made one critical mistake. They had found 17 colony worlds, and the humans had known about 18. The 18th was not in any record the Empire ever obtained. It was a small, cold, barely habitable rock on the far edge of the systems humans had explored at that time, chosen specifically because it was small and cold and barely habitable, and therefore completely uninteresting to anyone looking for targets. Approximately 40,000 humans had been there when the purge began. They were not military personnel. They were not politicians. They were engineers, scientists, teachers, builders, and children. They were also the ones who survived. The intelligence teams found the first references to what the survivors had built in a set of encrypted files buried inside an old deep space data relay that the Empire had never bothered to decode because it was transmitting on a band no longer in common use. When the relay was ancient, the encryption was sophisticated. It took the Empire's best code breakers 16 hours to crack it. What came out of it was a document called the Lazarus Accord. The Lazarus Accord had been written in the 3rd year after the purge by the 40,000 survivors of that cold, forgotten rock. It was written in plain, direct language with no poetry or sentiment, the kind of language that people use when they have cried everything out and have nothing left but clarity. It described what had happened. It described what had been lost. And then it described, in very specific terms, what was going to happen next. The survivors had voted. Every adult on that rock, every single one, had voted unanimously on a single resolution. They were not going to hide. They were not going to run further. They were not going to quietly fade away and allow the Empire to be right about them. They were going to survive. They were going to build. They were going to grow stronger, generation after generation, for as long as it took. And then they were going to come back. They called their program Project Lazarus, after an old human story about someone who returned from the dead. The intelligence teams followed the trail further and found more files, more records, fragments of history spread across hidden data caches in dead systems and encrypted in old human codes that no active translation system had ever been trained to read. The picture that assembled itself was staggering. Within 10 years of the purge, the survivors had begun building ships. Not the small exploration vessels humanity had used before, but warships, real warships. It designed with one purpose from the beginning. The cold rock had mineral resources in abundance. The survivors knew how to extract and process them. They knew how to design and construct. They had among them some of the finest engineering minds the human species had ever produced, because those minds had been sent to the colony for a research program that was running there when the purge began. They built in secret. They moved their construction facilities underground and into the deep space shadow of a rogue star that drifted through their region, a wandering stellar body that blocked most long-range sensor sweeps. They used no active communication signals that could be intercepted. They planted decoy debris fields around their location to confuse any scout probes. They were, from the beginning, thinking about this with extraordinary care. The first generation built the foundations. The second generation built the first ships. The third generation improved them. The fourth generation began training the first crews. Every single generation, without exception, did two things from the moment they were old enough to understand. They worked on the project, and they remembered. Remembering was not informal, it was structured. There were teachers whose only job was to teach the history of Earth and the 17 colonies to every child born on the ships. There were ceremonies held on the anniversary of the purge. There were databases maintained with the names of the dead, billions of names updated and preserved and passed from one generation to the next. There were rooms on the ships called memory halls, where the walls were covered with images of the lost worlds and recordings of the people who had lived there. Children grew up walking through those halls. They knew what had been done. They knew why they were here. They never forgot, and they worked. Generation after generation, they worked. The ships grew better with every passing century as human science advanced in isolation, focused entirely on military engineering and driven by the most powerful motivator a species can have. The original designs were improved, new propulsion systems were developed, new weapons were created, new armor was designed and tested and improved again. There was no waste and no distraction. The whole civilization, every person born to it, existed for one purpose. The intelligence chief who compiled the final summary for the War Council did so with the expression of someone who had been awake for 3 days and had not found a single piece of information that made them feel better. She stood at the head of the council table and delivered her report in a flat, careful voice. The human population living aboard the fleet and on their hidden base was estimated at approximately 400 million people. The fleet itself, based on the data available, consisted of no fewer than 4,000 warships. The smallest of those ships was larger than the largest vessel in the Imperial Navy. The weapons technology demonstrated by the 16-ship patrol wing in the Veiled Reach was, in the considered technical opinion of every engineer who had reviewed the sensor data, between 2 and 4 centuries ahead of anything the Empire currently possessed. When she finished speaking, the War Council was silent for a very long time. Grand Commander Vethal stared at the table. "How did we not know?" he said finally. 3,000 years. How did we not find them?" "We stopped looking," the intelligence chief said simply. "We declared them extinct. Nobody looked for something that was already dead." She paused. "They planned for that. The Lazarus Accord specifically states that they expected the Empire to stop searching within 2 centuries of the Purge. They built their timetable around our arrogance." Another council member, Admiral Seward, a hard and practical military man, leaned forward. "Can we match them? Can we build something to fight this?" "No," the intelligence chief said. "Not in 30 days. Not in 30 years. Their armor technology alone would take us decades to reverse engineer, even if we had a sample of it, which we do not. Their weapons are beyond our current understanding. Their fleet outnumbers ours 4 to 1, and each of their ships individually outclasses ours by a significant margin." She folded her hands on the table. "The 16 ships in the Veiled Reach destroyed 40 of our vessels in 11 minutes without taking a single hit. The full fleet is 250 times larger than that patrol wing. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. It was the silence of very powerful people realizing, for the first time, that power is not permanent, that the galaxy remembers things that you try to make it forget." Dravik, attending via transmission from his position near the Reach, listened to all of it. He thought about the voice on that transmission, the human voice, calm and unhurried, not angry, not triumphant, just steady, like someone who had been preparing for a specific thing for a very long time and was simply doing the thing they had prepared for. He thought about what his historian had called them, a footnote. He looked out at the dark stars of the Veiled Reach and thought about 40,000 survivors on a cold rock, voting unanimously, writing a document in plain, clear language, and then getting to work. And he understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant to be truly, completely afraid. The 30-day clock was still running. On the 29th day, the human fleet moved. It did not move as one. That was the first thing the Empire's long-range sensors reported. And it was the detail that chilled every officer in every command room across the Imperial network more deeply than anything else could have. A single massive fleet moving on a single target was something you could plan against. You could guess where it was going. You could mass your defenses. You could position your ships and pick your ground and make your stand. 4,000 ships splitting into dozens of independent task forces and vanishing into faster-than-light travel simultaneously in dozens of different directions was something else entirely. It was not an attack. It was a system-wide surgery, and the Empire had no idea where any of the cuts were going to land until they landed. Fleet Admiral Sarah Voss commanded the operation from the bridge of the UNS Endurance of Earth, the oldest ship in the human fleet. So we're 3,200 years old and still the most powerful vessel anyone in the galaxy had ever seen. She was not a tall woman, and she was not loud. She had short gray-black hair, calm dark eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent their whole life preparing for one specific moment and had no nerves left about it because she had already lived it 1,000 times in her mind. She was sixth-generation Lazarus Fleetborn. She had grown up on a warship, learned to walk in corridors that smelled of recycled air and engine coolant, and been taught the name of every one of the 17 lost worlds before she was 5 years old. She had given the fleet its orders 3 days earlier, personally, in a briefing that covered 47 individual task force assignments, each with specific targets, specific timing, and specific rules of engagement. The rules were detailed and strict. She had written them herself, and she had not been lenient with herself in the writing of them. The targets were military, shipyards, fleet command stations, communication relay networks, military supply depots, power generation facilities for orbital weapons platforms. Every target on the list was uniformly and specifically something that gave the Varun Empire the ability to project military force. Nothing on the list was a civilian settlement. Nothing was a populated planet's surface. Nothing was a food supply or a water system or a hospital or a school. Humanity had spent 3,000 years becoming something capable of destroying the Varun Empire. Cerebos had spent her entire adult life making sure that when the moment came, they would not become the thing that had destroyed humanity. The task forces hit their targets within a window of 4 hours. Across hundreds of light years of Imperial space, in dozens of star systems simultaneously, Varun military installations experienced the same thing. A ship or several ships appearing from FTL with no warning. A transmission on all frequencies, calm and clear, announcing the name of the task force and the name of the world it was honoring. A precise, efficient, and complete destruction of the target. And then the ships would be gone before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. The task force that hit the Cathara shipyards, the largest military construction facility in the Eastern Imperial territories, was called the Remembrance of Kepler. The ship leading it was a vessel of the same name, its hull bearing the painted image of a blue-green world that no longer existed. Before it fired a single weapon, it broadcast on every available frequency in the system. This action is taken in memory of the 4.7 billion people of Kepler 9. We remember their names, we remember their lives, we remember what was done to them. This strike is for them. And then it took the shipyard apart with methodical, unhurried precision, targeting support structures, power lines, dry docks, and construction arrays one by one, leaving nothing functional, harming no one in the process because they had given every worker in the facility enough warning to evacuate before the first shot was fired. Every task force did the same. Every strike was announced. Every world being honored was named. Namara, the names of the 17 lost colonies went out on every frequency across Imperial space, said aloud by human voices for the first time in 3,000 years, in places where human voices had not been heard since the Purge. Kepler 9, Nova Carthage, New Meridian, Mars Actual, Callisto Station. 17 names spoken clearly, carrying the weight of billions of dead. The Empire's communication network began fragmenting within the first 2 hours. Relay stations went dark one by one. Fleet commands found themselves cut off from their subcommands. Admirals sent orders that never arrived. Reinforcement fleets jumped to systems and found nothing there. The human task forces already gone, the targets already destroyed. The Imperial military, which had not fought a real war in centuries, Shurg was discovering the difference between being powerful and being ready. On the 14th hour of the operation, Drauvik tried to stop it. He had been recalled to Varun Prime at the start of the 30-day period and had spent the intervening weeks watching the War Council argue about strategies that he privately believed were useless. He had submitted his own proposal. Negotiate. Make contact with the human commander. Offer terms. He had been overruled twice and told that the Empire did not negotiate with extinct species. When the attack began, the Council had changed its position very quickly. Drauvik was authorized to make contact. He sent a transmission on the old frequency that the humans had used in the Veiled Reach, directed at the Endurance of Earth, which his sensors had tracked to a position 3 systems away from Varun Prime. During the response came back in under a minute. Sarah Voss appeared on his screen. She looked exactly as he had imagined she would, calm, clear-eyed, completely composed. Admiral Drauvik Sorn, she said. I know your name. Fleet Admiral Voss, he said, keeping his voice steady. I am authorized to speak on behalf of the Imperial Council. We are prepared to discuss terms. I know, she said. We would like to propose a halt to current hostilities while... No, she said. It was not harsh or angry. It was simply the final word on a matter that had already been decided. We are not pausing. We are not negotiating a ceasefire that preserves your military infrastructure so you can rebuild and try again in 100 years. We are finishing what you started 3,400 years ago. What you started, Admiral, was a war. And we are ending it. Drauvik leaned forward slightly. If you destroy the Empire, the systems under Imperial control will collapse. There will be... We are not destroying the Empire, Voss said. We are destroying its military. The distinction matters to us, even if it did not matter to you when you came to our worlds. She looked at him with an expression that was not hatred and not contempt, but something more complicated than either. You called us a footnote. Your historians put 4.7 billion people of Kepler 9 and 12 billion people of Earth, and everyone else we lost into a single paragraph in an old report that nobody reads. We spent 3,000 years making sure that when we came back, the galaxy would not be able to forget that we existed. Drauvik was quiet for a moment. And then he said, What do you want? What we have always wanted, Voss said. To go home, to rebuild what was taken, to make sure no other species in this galaxy gets a footnote written about them. She paused. Bring your remaining fleet to Varun Prime, Admiral. All of it. Mass it there. We are coming to finish this, and when we arrive, you will have two choices. You can fight and lose everything, or you can stand down and have a chance at something different. That will be the last choice the Varun Empire ever makes. Choose well. The transmission ended. Drauvik sat in the quiet of his command room on Varun Prime and stared at the blank screen for a long time. Something else was happening too, something that nobody in the Empire had predicted or prepared for. In 14 different star systems, the Imperial communication network's collapse had left local garrisons without orders and without the ability to enforce normal authority. In those gaps, other species that had spent decades or centuries under Varun occupation were moving. They were not fighting. They were transmitting. On a frequency that reached the incoming human fleet, messages began arriving from species with names that had not appeared in Imperial records as anything other than subject populations. The Dreth of the Outer Rings, the Suli of the Meridian Cluster, the Khan of the Deep Belt worlds. Small, careful messages, sent with obvious risk, formatted in ways that suggested the senders had been thinking about sending them for a very long time and had simply been waiting for the right moment. The messages contained coordinates, precise, detailed, as carefully sourced coordinates of weaknesses in Varun Prime's orbital defense grid, blind spots in the sensor network, maintenance schedules for the gun platforms, safe approach vectors that the Imperial defense plans did not cover. Years of patient observation, quietly recorded by people who had been watching their occupiers very carefully from the inside. Voss read the messages personally as they came in. She replied to each one with the same message, short and direct. We see you. We have not forgotten you either. Stand by. The Endurance of Earth and the main fleet changed course toward Varun Prime, incorporating the new information smoothly into plans that had already been detailed and complete, but were now more precise than any battle plan had a right to be. The oldest ship in the fleet hummed steadily around its crew, its ancient engines pulling it through space with the confident power of something that had been built to last and had proven it. On the bridge, Sarah Voss stood at the viewport and looked at the stars ahead. Somewhere beyond them was Varun Prime, the heart of the empire that had decided 34 centuries ago that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to exist. She thought about the memory halls of her ship, the faces on the walls, the names she had learned as a child standing in those corridors in the recycled air with her father's hand on her shoulder, learning to read the names of the dead before she could read anything else. She thought about what came next and what came after that and what she was going to put on that council table when it was done. The fleet flew on. The stars did not move. The reckoning was almost complete. Varun Prime was a beautiful world. That was the first thing that struck every human crew member who saw it on their screens as the fleet came out of FTL at the edge of the system. It was large and warm, wrapped in golden cloud bands with 3 small moons arranged around it like attendants. Its cities were visible from space, webs of light spread across 3 continents. It had existed as the seat of the Varun Empire for over 2,000 years. It had never in all that time had an enemy fleet arrive at its doorstep. That had changed. The Imperial Defense Fleet was massed in high orbit, 840 warships arranged in a dense layered formation, the last major concentration of military power the Varun Empire had left. Everything else had been shredded across dozens of systems over the previous 3 days. This was what remained. It was still, by the standards of any ordinary galactic power, an enormous and terrifying force. Against the fleet that came out of FTL on the far side of the system, it looked like a collection of candles facing a sunrise. The human fleet arrived in waves. First the forward elements, 300 ships spread wide, then the main body, then the task forces that had completed their assignments and rejoined the primary fleet in deep space on the way here. They assembled with a calm, practiced order that spoke of endless drilling over decades, each ship finding its assigned position without communication delay or confusion. At the center of it all, moving slowly and deliberately, was the endurance of Earth. From Varun Prime, to anyone with a sensor screen, it must have looked like the galaxy itself had turned around and decided to face them. Dravik stood on the bridge of his command vessel in orbit above the planet and watched the human fleet assemble. He had done what Voss had told him to do. He had brought every ship the Empire had left. He had massed them here. The War Council had given him full authority for this engagement, which in practice meant they had handed him the impossible problem and stepped back. He was not bitter about it. He had spent his career walking toward impossible things, and he was not going to change that now. But he knew the numbers. He had known them for 30 days. The 800 ships behind him were the finest warriors the Varun Empire had ever produced, and they were going to lose. The only question was how. And the only question he could actually affect was whether the people of Varun Prime survived the day. He opened a channel to the human fleet on the frequency Voss had used before. She answered immediately, as though she had been expecting the call at exactly this moment. "Admiral," she said. "Fleet Admiral," he said, "I have 840 ships behind me. You have more than that, and yours are better. You told me to choose well. I'm choosing." "Go on," she said. "I will order my fleet to stand down," he said. "Full stand down. Weapons offline, shields down, full surrender on every vessel. In exchange, I ask one thing. The people below us had nothing to do with the purge. They were not alive. Their grandparents' were not alive. What was done to your people was done by a government and a fleet that no longer exists. Or the civilians on that planet are not combatants. Whatever you do to this empire, I ask that you do not do it to them." There was a pause. "We were never going to," Voss said. Her voice was even, but there was something in it that Dravik could not immediately identify. Not warmth exactly, something quieter than that. "Give your stand-down order, Admiral. Every ship that complies will be held intact. Every crew will be fed and treated with full dignity. You have my word on it." Dravik looked at his crew. His officers were watching him with the expressions of people who had come to fight and were now being told to do something that felt more difficult than fighting. He held their gaze one by one, and then he turned back to his console. "All Imperial vessels," he said. "This is Fleet Admiral Dravik Sorn. Stand down. Weapons offline. Shields down. Full surrender. Now!" The silence on the command channel was absolute. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the first ship powered down its weapons. Then the next. Then in a spreading wave across 840 vessels, the Imperial fleet went dark and still. Dravik was the last. He gave his own ship's order last, stood up from his command chair when it was done, and felt something very strange happen to him. Not relief. Something he did not have a name for. The feeling of a thing being finished that had been going on for too long. Then alarms went off. One ship at the far edge of the Imperial formation had not stood down. It was a heavy cruiser called Varun's Fist, commanded by a captain whose name Dravik knew. One of a man who had never lost an engagement and apparently could not process the concept of choosing to. The Varun's fist powered up its main drives and turned toward the Endurance of Earth on a direct intercept course at full thrust, weapons hot, broadcasting on the Imperial command channel that he would die before he surrendered to a dead species. He made it approximately 200 kilometers before the Endurance of Earth reached out and caught him. It did not fire. No weapon was used. A field of some kind, projected from the bow of the ancient ship, caught the Varun's fist like a hand catching a thrown stone. The cruiser simply stopped. Its engines were still burning, pushing against something that did not move, and the ship went nowhere. It sat there, held in space, perfectly preserved, unable to do anything at all. Was the Endurance of Earth then proceeded to tow the Varun's fist slowly back to the Imperial formation, deposit it precisely where it had come from, and power down the field. Nobody fired after that. Sarah Voss came to the Imperial Council chamber in person 2 days later. She arrived without ceremony and without an honor guard, just herself and 2 aides who stood quietly at the door. She was shorter than most of the council members had imagined from her transmissions. She looked at the room with steady, unhurried eyes and sat down in the chair that was offered to her across the table from the surviving members of the Imperial War Council. She did not speak first. She placed something on the table. It was a small object, irregularly shaped, wrapped in a transparent case that preserved it carefully. On the inside the case was a piece of ceramic tile, cracked and darkened with age, roughly the size of a hand. On its surface, just barely visible under 3,000 years of accumulated time, were the remnants of a painted design. A simple drawing in a style that looked like it had been made by a child. Blue sky, a yellow sun, a small building beneath it. The council members looked at it. "That is a piece of a floor tile," Voss said, "from a school in a city called Cape Town on a planet called Earth. My grandmother's grandmother carried it off our burning world in her pocket when she was 11 years old. It has been passed down in my family for 34 generations." She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "We kept it so that we would remember what we were trying to get back to. Not power, not territory, not an empire." She looked at the tile. "A school, a place where children learn things. That is what you took from us, and that is what we intend to rebuild." Grand Commander Vethal, who had survived the fall of his empire with the specific dignity of a man who had no other options left, looked at the tile for a long time. Then he looked at Voss. "What do you want from us?" he said. "The same thing we wanted before any of this happened," she said. "To exist, to live in this galaxy without someone deciding that we are too dangerous to be allowed to." She leaned back slightly. "The empire is over. Not this world, not your people, not your culture. The empire, the fleet, the structure of power that allowed 34 centuries ago's council to glass 18 worlds because it was convenient. That ends. In its place, in under terms we will set together, something else will exist. You will have a voice in what that something else looks like, but you will not have a veto. You surrendered that when your ancestors wrote the Purge of the Weak campaign into history. It took 11 weeks to negotiate. There were hard days and broken sessions and moments where Dreivik, who was present throughout as the Empire's senior military representative, thought the whole thing would collapse. But it did not collapse. Humans were patient negotiators, it turned out. They had been practicing patience for a very long time. The final agreement abolished the imperial military structure, dissolved the territorial enforcement apparatus that had kept subject species under Varun control, and established a transition council that included representatives of the Dreth, the Suli, the Khan, and 14 other species that had been living under occupation for generations. It was not a perfect document. Voss said so herself when she signed it, but it was a real one. The human fleet did not disband. It remained. Not as an occupying force, but as what Voss called a guarantee. Something in the dark that reminded the galaxy what happened when the strong decided the weak were inconvenient. It proved to be a remarkably effective guarantee. On the day the agreement was finalized, Sarah Voss went back to the Endurance of Earth alone. She walked the ship's corridors the way she had since childhood, trailing her hand along the ancient metal walls, listening to the deep, steady hum of engines that had been running for longer than the Varun Empire's entire history of unchallenged dominance. She went to the memory hall. It was the same as it had always been. The faces on the walls, The names, billions of them in fine text covering every surface from floor to ceiling, Earth to the colonies, every lost world given its space, every lost person given their name. She had walked here as a child and as a young officer and as a commander, and now she walked here as the person who had just signed the document that ended the thing that had made this room necessary. She did not cry. She had done her crying a long time ago, in the private quiet of her quarters on too many nights to count, carrying the weight of what she was being asked to do and what it would cost to do it. Now she just walked slowly through the hall and read the names as she always had, the same ones she had always known, and some of the weight began, very slowly, to lift. Well, she stopped at the section for Earth, found the name she always found first, her grandmother's grandmother, the 11-year-old girl who had carried a broken piece of tile off a burning world in her pocket. She stood there for a while, then she went back to the bridge. On the star map, 17 lights had been added, 17 coordinates that had sat dark in human navigation charts for 34 centuries, officially listed as destroyed, officially listed as gone, were now marked with the names they had always had. In the years that followed, they would become memorial worlds, carefully tended and preserved, visited by people who came from across the galaxy to walk on ground that had once been home and to read the names of those who had lived there. Voss stood at the viewport. The stars looked the same as they always had. Well, they always did. They did not care about empires or purges or 3,000-year plans for vengeance turned into justice. They just burned, steady and patient, the way they had always burned. Somewhere in the ship's memory banks, a small program that had been set by someone a very long time ago began to run. Old music filled the bridge, thin and slightly distorted by centuries of digital preservation. The kind of music that had been made on a world that no longer existed by people who had no idea what was coming. It was simple and it was beautiful, and it had survived everything. Voss listened to it. She let it play all the way through. They had called humanity a footnote. Humanity had spent 3,000 years writing the last chapter, and the last chapter, when it was finally written, he looked less like an ending and more like a beginning, which, if you knew anything about humans, was exactly what you should have expected.